Sekarkai wanochel lautsi wut rinnupi Tiffany Creegan Miller ischach pachachikel chukarinin junti jonel kelapa Colby College. Yisamach rikendi tak molach estudios latinoamericanos rimolach kashlan chukaritak naoch ach achamaki. Napeni wachoni matioshik chiwe wanochel ramaishko kikin chukani matioshik chikeri molach estudios latinoamericanos chukakashlan ramaitoik rikin ritzichonem wakamin. Chukani Matioshich Chikeri Maine Film Center Chukari Tijonel Ana Almeida Cohen Romaki Samach. Hanila Yikiko Ramaish Owawe Sheya Iramach Sheya Iwetamapel. Keri Wakamini Wahoyitzihon Hupa Parwi Iximulew Rimolach Achamaki Kachikel Ruchapal Chuka Rupanopal. Ninkawomach Chawe Matiosh. So good day, everyone. How are you doing? My name is Tiffany Creegan Miller, Ischach Pacachikel. I am a professor in the Spanish department at Colby College. I also work in the Latin American Studies department, as well as the Critical Indigenous Studies initiative at Colby. So first, I would like to thank everyone for coming and being with us. I know it's a difficult time in the semester, so thank you for coming. And I'd also like to thank Latin American Studies as well as Spanish for sponsoring this event, and as well as the Maine Film Center and Ana Almeida Cohen for collaborating and working to organize this. I'm very happy that everyone is here giving your time and your knowledge as we talk through this event. And now I would like to talk just a little bit about Guatemala, Cachiquel Maya communities, their language and culture. So thank you so much. I look forward to talking with you. So just to briefly situate Guatemala, you see it's here kind of south of Mexico, and it also shares a border with Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. So it's one of the northernmost countries in Central America. In terms of Guatemala in and of itself, so here you see this with the red star, that's Guatemala City, and you have quite a lot of indigenous communities that are concentrated near Guatemala City, and then others that are more towards the north with the archaeological ruins that are tourist attractions. But in terms of what you may have already heard of about indigenous communities from Guatemala, I know there's a lot in the news about immigration from Guatemala to the United States. But what I would like to underscore is that there's also quite a lot of migration within Guatemala in and of itself. So you have quite a lot of people in these indigenous communities that leave their communities and move to the capital in search of employment as domestic workers or in search of educational opportunities. And we see that play out as well in the film with some of the domestic workers like Alma and Valeria, right, in La Llorona. So now to talk a bit about the indigenous languages spoken in Guatemala. So there are 24 indigenous languages spoken today in Guatemala, 22 of which are Maya languages, and then there's also Garifuna and Xinca. So of those 22 Maya languages, here in the center, you see Cachiquel, Quiche, and Sutuxil. At the beginning of my presentation today, I was speaking in Cachiquel, which is also the language that Alma and Valeria and some of the other domestic workers in the home in the film speak. In the film, you also hear some Ixil from the testimonies in the court proceedings. So to give you an idea, Quiche, there are 1 million speakers today, Cachiquel about 500,000, and Sutuxil about 60,000. These languages are all considered endangered, even though we have these large, robust numbers of speakers. And to give you a bit of an overview of the historical context of Guatemala, from 1960 to 1996, Guatemala experienced a very violent civil war. The majority of the victims were Maya, and in this context, basically doing anything that could mark you as Maya was inherently risky, right? So wearing indigenous clothing, speaking an indigenous language, practicing Maya religions could potentially mark you as subversive and basically an enemy of the state. So it's been estimated by the United Nations that approximately 400,000 Mayas were killed during the war. And we see a heightened period of violence between 1978 and 1983. In 1996 is when the peace accords were officially signed, concluding the violence. Within this period, Efrain Rios Montt was one of the most brutal dictators who reigned a period of violence on the country that many historians have argued was one of the most violent that the country experienced. He was the dictator of Guatemala from 1982 to 1983. And I included this quote for you because it really gets to the idea of his scorched earth policies, right? So he says, si no puedes atrapar los peces, tienes que secar el mar humano en el que nadan los peces de la guerrilla. So the translation would be, if you can't trap the fish, you have to dry the human sea in which the fish of the guerrilla swim. So it's very much so a scorched earth policy. You have a lot of human rights abuses, massacres at a large scale. And so what happens is that eventually he is tried in the Guatemalan court system for his abuses and violations of human rights, particularly against the Ixil community. So the film makes striking parallels between the Efrain Rios Montt trial and the trial for General Monteverde in the film, right? So one of the things that I wanted to point out is that Efrain Rios Montt's trial was in May of 2013. And basically he occupied political positions in Guatemala for a number of years, which lent him political immunity from ever being tried for these crimes against humanity. But his immunity ended on January 14th, 2012, when his term in office ran out. And then on January 26, 2012, he appeared in court in Guatemala City and was formally indicted by Attorney General Claudia Paz y Paz for genocide and crimes against humanity. And so moving along. And during this, during his court proceedings, we heard, similar to the film, testimonies from several Ixil survivors. So similar to the Monteverde trial in the film La Llorona, there were testimonies during Efrain Rios Montt's trial by Indigenous Maya Ixil women who then covered their faces to basically cover their shame for having been raped and sexually abused during this period. At the end of the court proceedings, Efrain Rios Montt was then sentenced to 80 years in prison, 50 years for genocide, and 30 years for crimes against humanity. And announcing the ruling, Judge Iris Yasmin Barrios Aguilar declared that the defendant is responsible for masterminding the crime of genocide. And she continued to say that we are convinced that the acts the Ixil suffered constitute the crime of genocide. Rios Montt had knowledge of what was happening and did nothing to stop it. So this was very, very momentous. It was Rios Montt was the first former head of state to have been convicted of genocide by a court in his own country. And then only a few days later, the sentence was actually overturned on May 21st, 2013. The Constitutional Court of Guatemala overturned the conviction. You see the press release from the Guatemalan newspaper Prensa Libre, and it basically voided all of the proceedings from the court back to April 19th, which made the conviction null, and ordered that the trial to be reset at that point, pending a dispute over the recusal of judges. So it was very much so a minuscule issue about the judges, but it was very much so seen as a setback for many Indigenous communities as they were seeking justice within their country. So we have that on the one hand in terms of the political setting of Guatemala in the post-war period. But now I'd like also to move to talk a bit about some of the cultural issues within Guatemalan Maya communities. So we also have, and I've titled this slide, Rimolach Maya, Maya activism and cultural revitalization. Also following the 1996 peace accords, and certainly this organization began long before the signing of the peace accords, but you see a lot of Maya intellectuals, activists who are promoting language revitalization, um, bilingual education in local schools, cultural revitalization more broadly. So you see not just political activism within the courts, but you also see a lot of work to have the preservation of their cultures within the country more broadly. So then just to touch on a few issues of cultural significance for Maya communities, I wanted to talk about Ritzyäq, so the traditional clothing. Clothing is very significant in the film as we see Indigenous Mayas wearing traditional clothing and others who do not, especially Alma and Valeria, when they are wearing their uniforms as domestic workers in the home of General Monteverde. So in Guatemala, women typically wear indigenous traditional clothing, whereas men do not. But of course, there are exceptions. So I've included some photos of men, especially in the Lake Atitlan region. The photo here at the bottom right, these men are from Santiago Atitlan, as you can see from the birds on their pants. Oftentimes, this clothing is made with a backstrap loom, so it can take some 3 or 4 months often to create a huipil or a traditional shirt. So this is also made with the kim or that's actually the loom it's in and of itself. And there's a number of different designs and figures that women incorporate into their weavings. So just to give you an idea, this is a chumil, and this one here is going to be a sun, a q'ij. Here you have a tzikin, a bird. This is a kamatzin. This is a kind of a snake figure. And oftentimes when you see the images in the huipils of women, you can actually associate that with particular towns, right? But what's been fascinating is that in the olden days, you could look at women and look at their shirt and say, oh, that woman is from San Juan Comalapa, or that woman is from Patsun. But now there's been quite a lot of exchange and globalization. So now it's become quite trendy that even if you're from Patsun or San Juan Comalapa, you may wear a shirt from Santa Catarina Palco, for example. So it's not always a definite marker of where someone is from. So now I'm going to talk just a bit about religious practices as well among Maya communities. As the film rightly depicts, they are very varied among Mayas today. So here you have the traditional Maya calendar. It's the Cholq'ij. It's based on a subset of 260 days. You have a set of 20 glyphs. These are associated with different energies and different symbols. And then with each glyph, you have a number from 1 to 13. So doing the math, 20 times 13 gets you to that 260-day calendar. And figures in the community who are most knowledgeable about the calendar are the guías espirituales, or the spiritual guides. So here I've included a couple of pictures of different daykeeper ceremonies. They often include incense, candles of different colors that are symbolically significant. It can also include fruit, as you see here, different types of breads, and they're basically offered to the Katatak Kamame, the ancestors. But then not all Mayas practice the traditional Maya religious practices that we see here, with the influence of liberation theology, it's also very common to see Mayas who more identify as evangelical. So with the influence of liberation theology, this is particularly in the 1970s and 1980s. And to give you an idea of a very distilled version of it, it's basically a connection between Christian theology and socioeconomic analyses. So it emphasizes a concern for the poor and political liberation for oppressed peoples, right? So it's often very common to see quite a lot of evangelical churches in traditional Maya communities. And then also with the cultural legacy from Spain following the conquest and colonization, many Guatemalan Mayas also practice Catholicism. And here we have a scene from Semana Santa or Holy Week in Santiago Atitlan. And for example, in the film with Valeria, she explains that she is Catholic. So and so I hope this helps contextualize the plurality and heterogeneity of Maya communities in Guatemala as we prepare for our conversation with Jairo Bustamante, the director of the film La Llorona, on Zoom with Maine Film Center on Wednesday, November 10th from 7:30 to 8:30 in the evening. Thank you so much, Janila Matios Chiu.